for just over 23 years, roughly from when he was in his late 30s, early 40s, until his early 60s. He's considered the last King of England from the House of Wessex, and he played a crucial role in setting the scene for the 1066 Norman invasion of England, just 9.5 months after he died. After his death, there would be a power struggle in which three men would contest the throne. Wessex Earl Harold Godwinson, the King of Norway, Harold Hardrada, and William of Normandy, with William emerging victorious. Let's have a look at where Edward the Confessor sits in our timeline of kings and queens. Right here, his long reign ending 886 years before Queen Elizabeth was crowned. Edward was born in around 1003 in Oxfordshire. He was the son of the then King of England, Ethelred, who ruled for almost 40 years between 978 and 1016. During the decades leading up to his birth, his father and England had been plagued by Viking raids. Ethelred had tried paying the Viking raiders off with Danegeld, a strategy which had cost him the equivalent of hundreds of millions of pounds. But this hadn't worked and the raids had continued. About a year before Edward was born, Ethelred sought revenge on the Vikings and ordered the St. Brice's Day massacre, in which innocent Danes living in England were slaughtered. One of those murdered Danes was the sister of Sweyn Forkbeard, the King of Denmark. Possibly partly in revenge for his sister's death, Sweyn launched a full-scale invasion, sending King Ethelred packing and having himself crowned King of England. At this point, Edward would have been around 10 years old. As his mother Emma was the sister of the Duke of Normandy, that's where she and Ethelred, and their sons Edward and Alfred, are thought to have gone. Edward returned to England for a short time afterwards when Sweyn Forkbeard died, and his father was crowned king for a second time. But when Ethelred died in 1016, and eventually Sweyn's son Canute became king, Edmund and his younger brother Alfred were forced into a more permanent exile. Though his widowed mother Emma then married the new king, Canute, Edward and Alfred stayed in Normandy. Canute had already had Edward's older half-brother, Edward, murdered, so it was probably felt that Emma's two sons would be safer with her family in Normandy. Edward would spend around 25 years in exile, though this is an assumption because there aren't any records of him until the 1030s. There is a report that in 1034, towards the end of King Canute's reign, the Duke of Normandy developed plans to invade England and place Edward on the throne, but the invasion was supposedly blown off course and abandoned. When Canute died and his son Harold Harefoot became king, Edward and his brother Alfred received a letter, purportedly from their mother Emma, who was based in Winchester, inviting them to England to challenge the king. So in 1036, the two brothers set sail for England. Edward, perhaps sensing there was too much risk attached to the venture, sacked Southampton and left for the safety of Normandy. However, when Alfred landed, he was greeted by Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, one of the most powerful men in England. He was promptly handed over to the sitting king, Harold Harefoot. Alfred was blinded, a way of guaranteeing he couldn't challenge Harold, as blind men weren't allowed to sit on the throne. Alfred died days later of his injuries. In 1040, Harold Harefoot died and was replaced by his half-brother Harthacnut. Harthacnut ruled for 2 years before dying at the relatively young age of about 24. With no children to succeed him, Edward was finally invited back to England and became king. Edward, an exile of around 25 years, was not in a strong position when he ascended to the throne of England, and he had to rely on powerful English noblemen to support his claim. Chief among these was Godwin, the Earl of Wessex, who was now to play a significant role in shaping English history. Not only would Godwin supply the Queen, his daughter Edith, who Edward married, he would also supply Edward's successor, his own son, Harold Godwinson. Even though King Edward would surely have resented Godwin, who after all, just a few years before in 1036 had handed his brother Alfred over to King Harold to be blinded and killed, it appears Edward had no choice but to seek out his support, go along with his advice, and marry his daughter. The Godwin family also more or less controlled the whole of southern England, so if Edward wanted to stay king, it must have been necessary for him to keep them on side. We don't know if Edward had to marry Edith in order to gain Godwin's support, but it's possible he eventually resented the match. The marriage was childless, leaving Edward without an heir, and in around 1051, during a crisis between Edward and Godwin, Edward sent Edith to a nunnery and may have considered divorcing her. It's possible Edward tried to exile Edith to a nunnery in 1051 because of a crisis in that year which was to prove a crucial test of Edward's power as king. It had come about when a relative of Godwin was chosen to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. Edward rejected this appointment and instead appointed Robert of Jumièges, who subsequently claimed that Godwin was illegally possessing land belonging to the church. This must have infuriated Godwin. To make matters worse, the king's brother-in-law, his sister's husband, visited England from Normandy and, on his way back, appears to have caused a riot at Dover. Edward claimed that his brother-in-law had been wronged and ordered Godwin to punish the local burgesses in Dover. When Godwin refused and took the side of the burgesses, the new archbishop accused Godwin of plotting to kill the king. Godwin was exiled. History could have taken a different turn at this point if Edward had divorced Edith, remarried, and had had an heir. Within a year, though, Godwin was back with a big army, and it appears Edward was forced to back down. Godwin died in 1053. The future King Harold, who would lose his life at the Battle of Hastings, inherited much of his land. Edward's reputation was later cultivated as a pious, religious man, but in reality, we don't know how much truth there was in this. We know he pursued an aggressive and ruthless policy against Scotland and Wales, sending his army to defeat the Scottish King Macbeth, later immortalised by William Shakespeare, and ordering the head of a Welsh prince to be delivered to him in revenge for a raid carried out on England. Edward was in his 60s when, in January 1066, he fell into a coma and died. Howard Godwinson would later claim that Edward, on his deathbed, had asked if he would become his successor. Of course, this was entirely disputed by William of Normandy, who claimed that the throne had been promised to him when he'd visited England in 1051 during Godwin's exile. This disputed succession would, by the close of 1066, end with the Battle of Hastings, which we'll cover in a subsequent video. Not mentioned yet is Edgar Atheling, who above all other contenders in 1066 could be said to have had the strongest claim to the English throne. Edgar, an actual descendant of previous kings of England, was the king that never was. A few videos back you might recall that we covered the life of Edmund Ironside, who was briefly king of England from April to November 1016 before he died and Canute took over. Edmund's children went into exile when Canute was crowned. One of his sons, Edward the Exile, had a son, Edgar Atheling, who was alive in 1066 when Edward the Confessor died. As we'll find out in a subsequent video, Edgar was actually chosen as the next king of England when Harold Godwinson was killed at the Battle of Hastings. Lacking an army, though, he was never able to back up his claim. Just under a century after his death, Edward was canonised as a saint by the Pope and given the name Edward the Confessor, supposedly to reflect the fact that he'd led a saintly life. Then again, it's perhaps a coincidence that William the Conqueror and his descendants staked their legitimacy on Edward the Confessor's own endorsement. Being endorsed by a saint is certainly not going to do any harm to that claim.